what are the other worlds like? If you're a monist, then the idea of a many worlds theory might seem to contradict monism or any kind of unitary reality principle, because at face value it would follow that there would be a single manifestation of that principle even if you're an idealist. However, if you're not a material monist and you're some kind of immaterialist or idealist, then it follows that because the material reality is not fundamental and that there is something beyond it, or rather underlying it, that you could plausibly have a plurality of instantiations of these immaterial conditions, or whatever is preceding a particular manifestation. So we have to answer why a particular manifestation is the way it particularly is. And if you're an idealist or an immaterialist, you cannot have material being arbitrary, especially its particular arrangement. You cannot have its particular arrangement be arbitrary. That has to be derived from an immaterial condition. And if you have an absolute reality principle in which to be potential is to be actual, and it's not like fundamentally limited and it's unlimited, then it potentially has an infinite number of conditions. So I'm going to put forward kind of a little bit of a model here, wherein we're trying to answer the question as to how worlds would develop, because obviously we live in a world and it's not static. It's not like a static manifestation of a form that doesn't change. It becomes, so to speak. So we're going to answer becoming as well. And we know this because moments are different. Even if they appear to be different, that the appearance of difference moment to moment, which is time, if there was no moment to moment difference, there would be no time. Then if there's even an appearance of this, essentially, that appearance has to be explained. So even if you were to say that it's kind of illusory, you still have to explain the dynamic of the appearance of change, right? Time and space are attributes of manifestation. We'll get that out of the way. So the system I'm going to propose to explain becoming, because what is becoming is, of course, some kind of condition, but there has to be some kind of eternal condition as well. And the most primary example of this is going to be reality's metastructure. And the way I like to explain the metastructure is, suppose you have your mind, and the mind can take on many conditions and states, but it never becomes something that isn't a mind. It's always a mind metastructurally, principally, it's always a mind. It never becomes, no matter what condition it takes on, it has a way that it is ultimately, right? So reality would have this as well. Reality would have a kind of metastructure. This would be what would directly precede a kind of world of forms, right? I would say that a Platonic world of forms would be directly mapped off of the metastructure, and that would be why the forms are eternal. Not because they necessarily are that metastructure, but potentially the foremost particularizations thereof. And then, so these would be the eternal conditions, right? And then the temporal conditions would be the interplay between these eternal conditions and the compositions they enter into. Of course, when you have conditions, theoretical conditions that are being mapped off of a metastructure, they kind of contain one another. Similarly, the henads would contain one another, souls would contain one another. These conditions would also, and it's probably that self-containment between them, that mutual self-containment, in one sense, perhaps not in a very literal sense, that actually produces in its procession the composition and different kinds of composition on more particular scales of reality. And then as reality becomes more particular via these different permutations or compositions of the forms, you would have even more defined potential for composition. And because there's potentially infinite conditions, there's obviously quite a wide array of conditions that could become. So we have then the metastructure and the forms mapped off of that metastructure. And then we have conditions that are arising via the interplay of these eternal forms. And you could say that these conditions are in a sense eternal and in another sense temporal. Just like in a soul, you could say that the soul is in a sense eternal. I believe Pythagoras is quoted as saying man's position is unique because he has 1 foot in the eternal and then 1 foot in the temporal, or the temporary. 1 foot in time and 1 foot in eternity. So, when it comes to many worlds, one of the interesting things to consider is what the other worlds are like. It would probably be like what other people are like. If you can fathom a world being a certain way, there is potentially a good chance that that world actually exists. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that just because something is fathomable, that it's actually possible. Or you might think that something is fathomable, but it's actually not. And were you to kind of actually go through the process of fathoming, it would incur a lot of negations. And your idea, in becoming less nebulous and more defined, would have to change. I don't think that every possible universe, in the sense that we use possibility, is necessarily possible. Like, if I were to look left instead of right, I don't think that any given soul exists multiple times, except for the single soul. But like an already particularized soul, that would be kind of odd. So I think a multiverse wherein it's essentially every possibility, in the sense that we think of possibility as kind of like probabilistically, I don't think that is how it could work. I think that we are potentially, in doing so, in assuming that we're making a hasty assumption that these things are actually possible according to the definition of our souls. Not that that would mean that reality is incredibly deterministic, but that free will doesn't really work that way. Although we do have a kind of intrinsic self-determinism. I would agree with Chris Langan there. But I don't think there's something to be questioned there, for sure, as to whether there could be multiple instantiations of a particular soul. Like, do you have an oversoul that has a number of particular souls? Potentially, but then those particular souls wouldn't really be you, would they? You're here. It might as well just be another soul that is relative to you, very similar. And that could be the case. That could very well be the case. And you already have souls that are relative to your own. And similarly, world souls probably have souls that are relative to their own. And there's probably, just like there are human souls that are more and less, increasingly more and less similar to your own soul, there's probably world souls that are increasingly more and less similar to this world. And of course, those world souls would be reconciled in a kind of singular world soul, right? So probably in that sense, we do have a kind of oversoul. But it would be at an increased layer, or increased scale of universality, whereas our own would be more particular. Just like if there was a world soul reconciling all particular world souls, it would be the truly universal world soul. It would be the world soul, really. Probably the demiurge. Or I would say potentially that a particular world soul is also a demiurge, that you have plural demiurgoi, and that you have the demiurge above that, and then you have nous. I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, you could potentially say that nous is the demiurge, like the Platonists generally do. But what are the other souls like? The other world souls like? What are the other worlds like? There's probably other... Okay, so we experience conditions in this world to greater degrees and lesser degrees. Think of the way society is in the West right now, and think of the way other societies are and have been. These conditions that we experienced phenomenally, and our ancestors experienced phenomenally, have been results of interplays between eternal conditions that exist underlying this phenomenal world, this instantiation of a world, right? And a world doesn't mean planet. I think we're all on the same page with that. So, it follows that there are worlds where those conditions that may have only been impressed to a lesser degree here were actually impressed to a greater degree, or are essentially more defined by those conditions. Whereas this world, each world would have something that defines its condition, kind of centrally. Whether you could really express that in like one word, probably not. It would almost be ineffable in a way. Well, not really. It's communicable, but it would be very, very, very tricky to do so, because it's obviously complex. It's a complex simplex, because it is, one soul, but because that it is of a very universal scale, it contains a lot of reality. It contains a lot of particularity, which makes it like a self-complicating simplex. That might remind you of Walter Russell, and if it does, good. So there's probably other worlds where conditions that we've seen in this world are more prevalent. If you can imagine a condition in this world and kind of imagine another world to be like that, it probably is. And I mean, for now, I'm speaking to very literal worlds that have phenomenalized, or conditions that have phenomenalized in this world, rather than like fantasy, because fantasy exists to the degree according to which it exists, which is as fantasy. Which means it's not fake, but it does exist to a certain capacity in reality, or a certain scale. So I'm not necessarily saying that there's going to be like a Lord of the Rings world or something like that. I'm not necessarily denying that either, but obviously those fantasy conditions are ones that have impressed this world the least. Perhaps we kind of try to summon them here, or summon them into reality. Arval made a video about attractor states, which I find interesting, because these attractor states could essentially be more or less eternal conditions that we can kind of invoke and try to impress upon. So let's assume that all conditions that are possible exist in every instance, every like phenomenal manifest instance, to some degree, right? So that, like, let's assume there's some kind of self-containment, but that because these conditions are resulting from an interplay of like the forms, that the composition varies. But we could tap into ones that are here less and potentially invoke them. I think there are times in history where conditions that are less present here have been invoked. There's potentially conditions that are less present here that are being invoked right now, actively, consciously. And there's probably times in history where the condition was quite different, and potentially some people invoked a condition that was not so prevalent, and now it is very prevalent. Is that making sense? I think the idea of attractor states is a good one. I think, but I think you'd have to have this kind of self-containment and presence of all forms, but a variation in the composition, which is possible because definition and conditions are not principally real. So if that sounded contradictory, if it sounded contradictory for composition of forms to exist, here's why it's not. It's not contradictory because definition and conditions are not principally real. The forms could be, if they're kind of mapped directly off the metastructure, and you could say those are the foremost conditions, but like the permutation of conditions, which I call definition, I model reality as an auto-definitional system, essentially, in that the progression of reality occurs as a kind of system of self-definition, but that self-definition is not principally real. It never adds to the conditions of reality. It never adds anything to the metastructure of reality. It never changes reality into something that isn't reality, if that makes sense. Things that are principally real never change into something that isn't that principle. Being never changes into something that isn't being. Souls never change into something that aren't souls, or mind. These things that are like principally fundamental to reality in some way. Of course, there's debate as to what we can consider fundamentally real, even in idealism, but you get the point. The definition and the composition of these conditions, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but it's not real as a matter of principle. It's not fundamentally real. So that's why you can have variation in the degree of, that's why you can have interplay. You can never have a privation of the form, but you can have a privation of definition. You can have variation in the composition of forms because they're mapped off the meta. The metastructure itself would be entirely, it couldn't even appear to be immanent. So almost the eternality of the forms I would have to stipulate is as due to proximity to that metastructure, which makes sense. Same thing with the henads. But yeah, I think that because of the presence of all conditions in an instantiation of a condition, let's say like a world soul, the presence of all forms in varying degrees in the composition, means that it can be recognized here below, and it can be invoked here below, and we can embody these conditions and proliferate them in the world soul that we now live in. You can certainly proliferate them in your own soul, which will basically you're almost guaranteed to not incarnate into this world when you reincarnate, because of the development of your soul. You will most likely incarnate into a world extremely similar. Potentially, it could potentially be extremely similar, like almost indistinguishable, but it would probably not be the same world. I highly doubt it. And that would depend on the condition of your soul, because the condition of your soul at a particular scale would have to be consistent with the universal conditions that it is participating in. And like Leibniz says or suggests in the monadology, in an enteleschi, souls of smaller scales, or monads of smaller scales, can pass into different larger scale ones, kind of the suggestion. So yeah, just a couple thoughts on the many worlds, our relation to worlds, what other worlds would be like. Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you later.